Hello, superhero ethics fans. This is Matthew, founder and co host. And as I've said before, my love for all the things this podcast talks about probably comes originally from Star Wars. And this month, I am super excited because not only have we just a few weeks ago had the release of Disney Plus and all the new Star Wars content and old Star Wars content that opens up, but in a few weeks, the new movie Rise of Skywalker, which will end the original full saga of movies, is coming out. And so in honor of that, we're going a little bit Star Wars crazy. I've been attempting to start a new podcast called the Star Wars Universe Podcast. And looking at how that's doing, that may continue, or it may be that, as I'm finding, because so many of those issues we're talking about are so related to what we talk about here on the Superhero Ethics Podcast, they may all just get wrapped in together. I recorded a great episode with our friend Jonah Kelman on the ethics of the clones and all the questions that come up around clone soldiers and the Jedi. And unfortunately, we're having some technical difficulties with that, so it may be a little longer before we get that one launched. So I wanted to share with you one of the episodes of the Star Wars Universe podcast that I've put up, which I think is going to be relevant to a lot of you all here. For it, we're bringing Paul Hoppe, the original co-host of this podcast, back to talk about all the different Star Wars movies and media and how we rank them, both in terms of what we enjoy most, what we love, and which ones raise the questions that we like here on Superhero Ethics. So with that, please enjoy this. Know that Becky Allen is going to be recording with us very soon to talk about the upcoming movie and our hopes and expectations for that. We'll get that episode about the clones up pretty soon. We have a lot of great Star Wars content coming to you in the next couple of weeks. And then we have all sorts of other great things coming in the new year. So thank you very much. Enjoy. I have spoken. Welcome, everyone, to this first episode of the Star Wars Universe Podcast. I'm Matthew Westfox. I'm one of your hosts. For anyone who knows me from the Superhero Ethics Podcast, welcome. Thank you for coming over and checking this out. And if you have gone back into the history of superhero ethics or been a fan of us for a long time, you probably remember our original co-host, Paul Hoppe. Paul is someone I've been best friends with for many more years than probably either one of us want to admit, because we're still young people. But some of our first conversations were about Star Wars and about questions about Star Wars and whether Luke or Darth Vader was the protagonist and all sorts of great things. So I'm super excited that my first co-host is Paul. Paul, how are we doing today?
We're doing good. It's early, way earlier than I'm used to being awake. I think this is more your domain.
This is also true.
Of time, and we're gonna go back to a lot of really old movies and some pretty recent ones.
Yeah, sounds good. So let's just start with the basic though. What do you love about Star Wars? And I'm asking this both because I think it's just kind of a nice way to start and be grounded, but also because it helps inform, like, what's the rubric you're bringing when trying to decide. Oh, I should actually introduce our topic for today. As a way of getting started, I hope you can tell all folks that we are off to a good start, and this is going to be a well-organized, disciplined podcast.
Very disciplined.
But no, there's a meme that's been going around of having people list all of these Star Wars movies and sometimes all the Star Wars properties, including like movies and TV shows, from best to worst. Excuse me. And so, as a way to get started with this new podcast, which is going to in time cover the new movies when they come out, the new TV show like The Mandalorian. We're going to look back at some of the great TV shows like the Clone Wars and Rebels. I have people getting lined up that we're actually going to do a rewatch of all of the movies to get ready for the last one, number 9, the Rise of Skywalker. But I love the idea that for this first podcast, we'd kick things off by literally just going over that list of from Paul and I, what are our favorite Star Wars movies, what are our least favorite, and why? Because it's a great way to kind of ground this whole discussion of the Star Wars universe. What do we love? What do we wish was better? And how do we look at it all? So, with that in mind, Paul, what do you love about about Star Wars? What brings you to all this?
Well, I probably should have mentioned this before agreeing to do the podcast, but I don't really love Star Wars anymore.
Okay.
In fact, it vexes me in some ways. At the same time, it's provided some of my earliest, best movie memories, And more recently, also there's things that I have loved within the Star Wars universe, and content that I've really enjoyed in ways that maybe I didn't even really love about the original films, or then the other ones, which we'll get to. But
we're going to go from least favorite to best, so I
Yeah.
think the prequels will be talked about pretty early.
Yeah, spoiler alert. I don't like sand either, but what I hate more than sand is terrible dialogue. So, I think the mythology, the depth of the world, or the breadth of the world, really.
Yeah.
And just the fact that I think it blends sort of popcorn action with a certain degree of philosophical inquiry that at least provides the viewer an opportunity to think about a lot of different things.
No, I think I'm very much on the same page. I'm someone who, there are most movies I can tell you the first time I saw it. I cannot remember the first time I saw Star Wars because I was one of those kids who, my parents had a Betamax, which were the precursors to VHS machines, and my mother told me that often if she needed me to just not bother her for an hour or two so she could do other stuff in the house or the like, she would just put the Star Wars movie into Betamax. I have vague memories of this, but not, and I certainly can't remember the first time I saw it. I can't even remember the first time I saw Empire. The first one I really remember seeing for the first time is Return of the Jedi. So these movies have been kind of with me since my earliest childhood. And I think, like you, I've had quite an evolution with them. I'm still very much a fan. I'm still someone who loves them dearly. But I've certainly gone through some high points and some real low points in the prequels, and had my feelings really changed and evolved on them in a lot of ways. Especially as some other one new property will come out that kind of puts everything else into a new light. One thing we'll talk about a bit, for example, is the TV show The Clone Wars, which I think is one of the better parts of the Star Wars universe that doesn't get talked about often, and makes the prequels make a lot more sense to me in some ways. Though still very, very bad dialogue writing.
Right.
So with that, let's kind of kick things off and go. What is the worst movie on your list? What is the worst movie, TV show? What is the bottom of your list?
I mean, Attack of the Clones. It just has to be. It's the worst of the prequel trilogy to me. It's sort of like The Matrix Reloaded in some ways, where it maybe has more of the good stuff from the first one, and by the first one I mean The Phantom Menace. But It's also got way more of the bad stuff, and just Anakin as a young adult just doesn't work for me, and the dialogue's just so bad, and it just
you mentioned
hurts me.
I don't like Sandland line, and that's I think that is universally held as probably the worst, but there's a number that are pretty darn close.
Yeah, it's not like an outlier. It's just the worst of the worst amongst a lot of really bad dialogue.
Yeah. It is also very low on my list. There's a couple of others that are lower on my list, but I which I'll get to in a second. But I will say I'm pretty close with you, especially because for me the heart and soul of these movies is the stories that it tells about what it means to fall from grace, to what it means to try and be a good person and to let yourself be taken over by negative emotions. And however you phrase that or feel that, but I've always really been struck by the whole Yoda idea of, you can start out hating things for the very best of reasons. You can start out being afraid for the very best of reasons, and that will eventually, lead you down a dark path.
Right.
And the movies had done so much to build that up that I felt like getting to see... In some ways, these are kind of a good example of why I don't like prequels in general, because from Empire and Return of the Jedi, and even Star Wars, we had been allowed to have our imagination sort of fill in the gaps of what Obi-Wan and Yoda told us of what happened to Anakin as he became Darth Vader.
Right.
And on some level, I feel like no movie was ever going to do a good job coming close to what, our imagination had been able to sketch out.
Yeah.
But because of that, that was the bar this movie had to hit, and it failed it
dramatically.
Yeah, it was a very high bar, and to achieve it in one movie, really, I mean, they had 3 movies to do it, so there's a little bit more, okay, maybe you could pull it off, but as we'll get to later, I think if you have a lot more time to tell a story, you can tell a much more compelling version of that story.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're both going to be talking there about the Clone Wars TV show, which I think does a much better job, frankly, of showing over many seasons of television the slow decline.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of Attack of the Clones. So my worst movie, and I will say my list is probably longer than yours because I have Attack of the Clones is the second to last of the more officially known movies.
Right.
But then after Attack of the Clones, that's number 11 on my list. I then have going down Ewoks: The Battle for Endor, The Ewok Adventure, the Star Wars Christmas Special. Then I think the next worst is a home movie I made when I was 8, other home movies, and then I list an hour of George Lucas watching paint dry, all of which I think are better than my least favorite, Solo. I very rarely have this much virulent hate for a movie, but that's how I feel about Solo. I thought the acting and dialogue were awful. I thought Donald Glover as Lando was far and away the best part of the movie, and I was sorry that he was so wasted in this movie. But I think more than anything, it was just that it didn't feel like... It's not just that it didn't feel like a Star Wars movie. Nothing about that actor made me think of Han.
Right.
And again, in the same kind of prequel thing, I mean, it's one thing to say, here's how here's how this major plot point became what it is. And that's not something I love, but at least it's something I kind of care about.
Mm-hmm.
What I really don't care about is, here's how your favorite character got this particular character tick, or here's how your favorite character got this piece of clothing, or this thing that he, keeps on the dashboard of a spaceship, all that. As well as the fact that it just didn't fit my understanding of the canon of the Star Wars universe. So, I know you see it differently, but for me, Solo is very much the worst Star Wars property that's ever been put out.
So, where does Han Solo rank in your sort of, the character, primarily from the original movies, but also, I guess, from the current trilogy, with amongst the collection of Star Wars characters?
He's one of my absolute favorites.
Right.
I would say, I think, this was something you helped me understand 20 years ago, but I do think that the pivotal character, at least of the first 6 movies, is Anakin, not Luke.
Right.
And frankly, until Last Jedi, I would have said that Luke was not my favorite character. I think he goes through some interesting, and I adore what he does in Last Jedi, but I think Han was definitely a more interesting character to me than Luke. He's probably in my top 3. I would say Anakin, Leia, and Luke are my, but it's so hard because Obi-Wan and Yoda play much smaller roles, but their characters are so interesting.
Yeah.
But I'd say he's definitely a character I'm very fond of and find very relatable.
Right. And so, he was never a character that held any particular significance to me.
I can see that.
I liked kind of his character arc, and he had some of the best lines in the original trilogy, maybe the best line.
I love you, I know.
Right, yeah, exactly. But, I'd say that his sort of backstory, when I heard they were making a Solo movie, I was kind of like, why?
Yeah.
But I saw it, and I was like, I didn't love the beginning of it, but there were points where it drew me in, and there were parts about it that I really liked, particularly Lando. I thought Glover did an outstanding job of that. And,
totally agree with you there.
For me, that was the best part of the movie. I also liked the droid, and it kind of gives, I guess, more significance to the Millennium Falcon as the series goes on, or earlier, things that happen after that, because now there was always this sort of feeling that it was not like it was a sentient ship, but like it was a character, and that, the Solo kind of gives the ship a backstory of actually, having part of a person in it, you know?
Right.
I mean, depending on how you look at droids, but that's how I see droids. And so I thought that it was interesting in that regard. I didn't dislike the performances the way you did. I don't think it's a great movie or anything, but
yeah.
I definitely liked it a lot more than I expected to, and I think that's because my expectations were just so low that that wasn't even a pun
I think that's fair. I think I
was.
said to someone that if I had gone into that movie planning to watch a space heist movie that wasn't set in any particular universe and didn't have any characters I cared about, or even maybe it was like Rogue One, it was about characters I'd never met, but in that same universe, I think I would have liked it more. I think so much of it was about, for me, that it at least Attack of the Clones, Attack of the Clones is correct about where Anakin starts and where Anakin ends. Right. It just does a terrible job of showing that journey.
Yeah.
This movie felt wrong to me about, in part because part of what I like so much about Han in that first movie, A New Hope, is that he is just a guy who is beaten down by the world and only out for himself. And that to me, and so his turn to come and rescue Luke and help blow up the Death Star has so much power. Mm-hmm. For me, when you make it just he actually was a total idealist and he really cared about things, but he got his heart broken, it makes his turn in New Hope have so much less meaning to me. It just doesn't feel like this gets Han to where he needs to be by A New Hope. But
go ahead.
But I can well understand why for you, if especially if Han wasn't one you cared about as much going in, this could be a much different movie experience for you.
Yeah, and it was because, he was never my favorite character, so going back and doing a backstory for him didn't have any real risk for me, the same way it does, like with Anakin, and then doing a future story for him and for Luke and for Leia. Some things that I liked about it was just that it felt very removed from the rest of the series, that it was in the same universe and kind of helped flesh that out, but didn't have anything to do with Jedi really. And and I sort of see Han a little differently, where I feel like in the first movie he was always that guy who was gonna come back for a friend,
Right.
I mean, he had a really good friend at that point in time that was Chewie, right?
Right.
So it's like I feel like he was kind of always that guy, like the outlaw Josie Wales kind of. I haven't actually seen that movie.
We just quoted Rounders.
Yeah. But
and that actually raises a really good question, which we can get into maybe when I do the rewatch of A New Hope, is does Han turn around because he decides fighting the Empire is worth it? Or does Han turn around because Luke and Leia have become to him people like Chewie, and he turns around to rescue his friends?
Yeah. I think that's a good question. Or, does he want the reward money?
Yeah. and the pretty princess,
Right. And I think the answer can be like all of the above,
Right.
But I feel like it's a little bit more because of his friends, like because they've become friends. Like he's bonded with them over this, pretty harrowing experience escaping the Death Star. And he's like, all right, I'm going back.
Yeah.
We're going back,
that's
Chewie,
fair. That's definitely a good view on it. So I know I may have included a couple of other things on my list.
I don't have any of those on my list. They'd probably be above Attack of the Clones.
Yeah. Well, the ones that I have above Attack of the... I'm trying to think if I have anything...
below. I don't know. I don't think I've seen your home movie. But
No. Very few people have, and that's for the best.
I'm pretty sure I'd love to. But.
Yeah, I did. Most of them I put below Attack of the Clones. The Star Wars Christmas special is a very particular kind of masochism.
Right.
I find a little bit of joy in it, but it's horribly painful. I would say the Star Wars episode of The Muppet Show I have is the next one above Attack of the Clones. But that's also perhaps not universally accepted as legitimate canon.
Right.
But so what's your next one after Attack of the Clones, and what number are you on? Just so we're kind of tracking.
So I've got 11. I actually have 12 11 entries with 12 works of fiction, and I'll explain why later.
Okay.
So 11 is Attack of the Clones, 10 is Phantom Menace, and 9 is Revenge of the Sith. So I have those three just all at the bottom.
Okay.
And I guess Revenge of the Sith, I think, is the least bad out of those, because even though I feel like it does a terrible job of getting from point, like, Y to Z,
right.
It has, there's just, like, some cool stuff in it, you know?
Yeah.
That I feel is mostly missing from Phantom Menace. Yeah, so it just, I feel like there's more good stuff in it.
Yeah.
Darth Vader yelling out, "No," like that really kind of just, I just think the movie just needs to stop just before that. But
well, so let me back up a second though.
Yeah.
So number 10 on your list is Phantom Menace.
Phantom Menace, yeah.
So why is that one there?
It just, you know, back when it came out, I was like, oh wow, a new Star Wars movie. You know, this is amazing, and like there was a level of expectation for it, you know, and then I went and I saw it, and it took like a little bit to be like, oh no, oh no, this isn't good, you know.
Yeah.
And I mean, Natalie Portman was one of my favorite actresses, you know, and like she just had nothing to work with there. I think the choice of having, you know, this story with like this really super young, you know, Anakin. Like, I kind of wish, like, he'd started as a teenager or something, or, like, the whole midichlorian thing, like, the pod racing or whatever it was, like, just felt like, what is this movie? And then, I mean, Jar Jar, you know.
I was going to wait, wondering how long we'd get to
Yeah.
Mr. Banks, but yeah. I have Phantom Menace a little bit higher, but I definitely agree with you. It is to me, especially because you're right, it was so disappointing.
Yeah.
I really expected a much... You know, and partly is that because I was just so built up, we'd had, you know, in the last 5 or 8 years or so, we've gotten used to fairly regular Star Wars content. It had been, I think 18 years, 15 years since between Return of the Jedi and Phantom Menace with very little coming out.
Yeah, I think 16 maybe.
Yeah. And so there was all that build up, and I agree with you, the midichlorians. I was commenting with someone else who pointed out, you know, listen, you have to understand that you have to forgive Phantom Menace because Phantom Menace was made to be a really like a younger kids movie. And to me, that's the fundamental flaw of it. Star Wars, as I just mentioned, like I was 2 years old and I could adore Star Wars, but it wasn't dumbed down for kids in the way that I felt Phantom Menace. Lucas felt that he had to kind of like really reach down to younger kids and like throw in Jar Jar Binks and make things kind of cutesy and fun. In a way that just felt so, especially because I think, and we'll get to this when we talk about Clone Wars and The Last Jedi, to me, by far, one of the most interesting stories is the decline and fall of the Jedi. And I think, I thought Phantom Menace, they give some hints of that in interesting ways. But again, I think they did it in such weak ways. And kind of like what we talked about with Solo, I just felt like there were so many story beats that didn't get paid off, you know? In the original movies, Obi-Wan deciding to take on Anakin is taken on as this, like, he sees potential in him and the Council doesn't, and he really believes it. And so to have it just be a promise to a different Jedi Master, there were just a lot of moments like that just felt wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it didn't jibe with what we learned in the original series, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I have Phantom Menace as quite low, but I actually have just below it. My number 10 is the Clone Wars, the movie.
Oh, okay.
Again, it just sounds like it, and it's funny because when I watch the Clone Wars TV show, it gives me so much more affection for some of the characters and the way it's presented and the world it creates. And I think, oh yeah, maybe Clone Wars, the movie isn't so bad. I go back and watch it. I'm like, no, it's still a really bad movie.
Yeah, the animated movie, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Clone Wars animated movie.
Yeah, so that's 8th on my list. That's like the lowest aside from the prequel trilogy. I don't really remember it that well. I think I watched it twice, but like I didn't hate it and I didn't love it. I was just kind of like, okay, you know, like it didn't do much for me. It's kind of like the plot sort of like, okay, you know, it was like a weird. I feel like it was a weird publicity stunt to get people to watch the Clone Wars TV show or something, you know. And it's just amazing that they made this feature film that was so inferior to this series that you could take like 3 episodes out of, 5 episodes out of, and have like a way better movie, you know?
Very true. And also, introducing characters like General Grievous, who become interesting in the show, but the movie. So it sounds like you and I we have slightly different orders, but our 8 through 10 is pretty similar. So if I understand, your 8 through 10 is, starting from 8, it's Clone Wars, and then Revenge of the Sith, and then Phantom Menace. For me, my number 8 is Revenge of the Sith, my number 9 is Phantom Menace, my number 10 is Clone Wars.
Yeah. So you just have Clone Wars 2 spots lower than I do, which, like, I can't argue with that. I mean,
yeah,
you know.
Exactly. And I do think if I hadn't watched Clone Wars, the TV show, Revenge of the Sith and Phantom Menace would be even lower for me.
Right.
Because I do think Revenge of the Sith, I think you're right. It doesn't pay off the things because they've been so badly set up in Attack of the Clones. And frankly, the one pivotal scene that the prequels most needed to do is the scene where Anakin becomes Darth Vader.
Right.
And it was garbage.
Yeah.
It was just so badly done.
Yeah. Do you mean where he physically gets turned into Darth Vader? Or you mean where he turns and...
Yeah, no, because not when he adds all the electronic stuff.
Right.
When he intervenes, helps the Emperor kill Mace Windu, and then goes to his knees, and the Emperor says, now become Darth Vader.
Right. I agree. That's the more grievous scene. Yeah. Egregious.
It does have, the Emperor saying rise in a voice so low that I think, it can be heard in great depths under the sea. That moment's fantastic.
Yeah, that's the best part of the movie. But, the setup just doesn't... That's... I could argue for putting Revenge of the Sith, worst, because that should be, the moment in the entire series, there's a couple moments, but that moment should be equal to, Luke laying down his lightsaber in Return of the Jedi.
Yeah.
In terms of payoff, and it just isn't at all.
And I will say, though, that the thing that rescues it for me is that another moment that should have incredible emotional resonance, Order 66, is still not as good as I would want it to be, and is much more. It's much more direct than I wanted it to be.
Right.
But it does have a lot more power. I definitely teared up the first time I watched Order 6 carried out, and especially when Anakin goes to the younglings. I thought at least that scene, it captures a lot of the power and the importance of that moment, even though some parts of it are pretty bad.
Right. And it, doesn't really make sense because, the Jedi can read minds, and, could they really conceal a plan this way? But it has an emotional resonance that the other scene does not.
Right. It lets us, though, bring up, I think, one more, and this is kind of a complaint about Attack of the Revenge of the Sith, but really it's a complaint about all of the prequels and why I think for both of us they're all so low. The world of the prequels here doesn't match the canon because, and you and I know I've talked about this, one of the things that's established early on in A New Hope is that, Vader and Obi-Wan are these last vestiges of it's referred to by an imperial officer as a dying, a long dead religion or a dying religion. And the idea is kind of no one's seen or heard from the Jedi in hundreds of years, and it's totally forgotten, and most people aren't even sure that it exists. Whereas, by the prequels, most of those officers serving at the top level of the Death Star would probably have been low-level officers fighting alongside the Jedi.
Right. Exactly.
Or fighting against them if they were separatists. Yeah. It makes no sense.
Yeah, it doesn't. The timeline doesn't work. And they could have made it work by just having none of the same characters from the prequel trilogy to the current, from the original trilogy to the prequel trilogy, aside from Vader, the Emperor, Obi-Wan, Yoda, who all could be hundreds of years old, because why not? Because Jedi and who knows, right? And then, then you've got the issue of, well, how would Vader be these 20 whatever-ish, Luke and Leia's father, but Padme could have been in carbonite, or they could have been in carbonite, or whatever, or because of travel in space, maybe time, they were relativity, blah blah blah. I don't know, but the point is you could have actually made it so it felt like like in The Last Airbender, where Aang's frozen for 100 years, and then he comes back, he's like, I don't recognize this world. It's not like he was asleep in a coma for like 20 years and wakes up. It was just like, things don't change in 20 years the way they change in a century, right?
Yeah. Or even if you don't go that far, you can, it could just be that, like, look, the last heyday of the Jedi was 500 years ago, and just a few tired people were barely keeping it alive, Anakin and Obi-Wan and Yoda. There's so many ways it could be done.
That's true.
This way, it just... And to me, that's always the most important part of a prequel, is if a prequel means that later, or even the flashback scene, if it means that something else you've already told me about the current world doesn't make sense, like, that's not an acceptable bar.
Right, you've done exactly the opposite of what you should be doing with the prequel.
Right. So let's go on to at least, because my next one is one that I'm actually pretty fond of, even though it's lower down on my list. My number 7 is the Clone Wars TV show.
Oh, okay.
And I'll admit, this is one of those where I didn't want to watch it for a long time, and you kept pushing me to watch it. And I just think it is such fascinating storytelling, because kind of what you did, what you said about Solo, about how it kind of fills in some of the gaps of what's happening, what's happening in the trenches.
Yeah.
Clone Wars does so much of that. It
Absolutely.
tells the stories of clone soldiers and what's happening with them, and clones who decide maybe they don't want to be soldiers.
Yeah.
We get whole planets of people who don't want to be part of either the Republic or the Separatists, and presumably either the Empire or the Rebellion later. They just want to be left alone.
Yeah.
So you got me into it. So what for you? What are things you love about the Clone Wars or don't like about it?
So it's number 3 on my list, actually.
Nice.
It's it's the actual nuanced story of how Anakin Skywalker becomes Darth Vader, basically, without the final, how he gets across that line. But you can just see him taking step after step after step, and how some of it's him. Some of it's kind of how he always was, his mentality, and how he's drawn in that direction. And then some of it's how circumstance pushes him that way. Some of it's how, the Emperor, how Sidious manipulates him in that way. And some of it's how, the failures of the Jedi and the Republic push him in that direction. Because the Jedi really, in that series, have a lot of failings. And... you see a lot more of sort of the Jedi kind of at their height, but also at their nadir in some ways,
Very much.
Yeah.
I'll get more into this when we get to The Last Jedi, because it's a point that I think is really punctuated in that movie. But one of the things that I've always been found, to me, the take that the Clone Wars gives us on the Jedi is of a dying religion.
Yeah.
Especially because one of my academic backgrounds is in sociology of religion, and one thing we often talk about is, if the idea is that a religion is born around some kind of article of faith, and you can argue whether that there's any reality to it or not, but whatever it is a belief in something greater, and then over time, institutions and authorities get built up to help people worship that something greater. Mm-hmm. But what often happens is that eventually over time, the worship becomes about the institutions and the authorities and not the thing that it's supposed to be pointing to.
Right.
And to me, that's exactly what happens with the Jedi, and Clone Wars tells that story so well by both sort of showing how the Jedi are kind of becoming lost in their own authority and lost in the idea of, like, they're at that point where they're so convinced that they're right that people who doubt them must be wrong.
Right.
As well as introducing us to Force users on both the so the light side and the dark side, and breaking that whole binary.
Yeah.
Who want nothing to do with either the Jedi or the Sith.
Right. There's like these other, dark side Force users who are not Sith, and there's these other, light side, or just kind of just use the Force and like don't think of it in that binary. Think of it. Yeah. It is what it is, and they just sense it and feel it and use it. And the series just adds so much depth and world building, and I like that take, as far as Jediism as a religion, and that basically turns into, kind of like the Knights Templar or something, or like, I mean, you can...
Or most churches today.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I only say Knights Templar because they got swords and they go around killing people.
Yeah, also true.
But like in terms of, spreading their doctrine, and I mean, churches have done that in other ways throughout history, right? Especially when they get linked up with the state and armies, and...
Which the Jedi and the Republic very much are.
Exactly. It's like you can't really separate the Jedi from the Republic. It's all kind of one big thing, and the Clone Wars gets into some of the interactions between that, like who's in charge. Like all these Jedi are generals in the Republican army, right?
Right.
Which is a really weird dynamic when you think about what the Jedi say they are. Like
the keepers of peace in
the
galaxy.
Right. It's like, well, then why do you go around with a sword all the time? And that's one of the things that I guess where I sort of kind of lost some of my... I kind of lost and gained appreciation for Star Wars because of that idea, because I feel like that is present there and it can be appreciated, and that makes me like Star Wars more. Right. But on the other hand, I feel like it's not pointed to directly, and it's kind of unclear whether the creators of the movies kind of like want it to be that. And this will kind of run into my number 7 in a moment, where I feel like you can look at it and be like, the Jedi are this, it's this dying religion, and they're kind of this corrupt body with the Republic, but then it's also like, but they're the good guys, Right. And so I just go into like what my number 7 was The Last Jedi, which, I kind of hated it and kind of wanted to put it last, but at the same time, there's stuff in it that's really good, and it brings up a lot of really interesting things. Also, the prequel trilogy and the animated Clone Wars movie are just so bad that they just,
right.
Yes. But the Last Jedi, I feel like is about like who the Jedi are, right?
Right.
And who they're gonna be, or if they're not going to be anymore. And to me, one of the things that I least liked about it was, I think at the end of it, like, Rey's a Jedi, but like I kind of don't want her to be. Like I want Luke to burn all that. Like, be like, you know what? The Jedi were wrong, or where they ended up was wrong. And like, be you. Like, feel the Force, be yourself. Understand, I mean, because like Luke, like his father, was very in touch with the light and dark sides of the Force. I mean, he was, a New Hope. Like, he and in the original trilogy, like, he really does, I think, symbolize hope ultimately. But right. He has that darkness in him, the way, like, really, like, everyone does, right? I mean, That's just being human, or being a person, because human isn't broad enough, especially in Star Wars, right? But and Rey has that, like, a lot,
Yeah.
Like, she's got darkness all up in her, and that's one of the things that I think is so interesting about her as a character. And I think that's one of the best things about the new series. And I just wish that they'd kind of lean into that a little bit more, and not kind of be like, but actually she's going to be a Jedi and they're going to save all these books, and like it'll go on, and it's kind of like, maybe it's time for a new thing. And instead of like, cause like The Last Jedi, basically, like, the point is kind of like, Luke defeated Vader by turning him back into Anakin, and thus defeated the Empire, or they did together, or, however you want to say it. And then he's like, I'm going to go and start a Jedi school. And that's what, like, the original post-quel novels, or sequel, I think the word sequel.
Post-quel.
But like the novels, right? That then are, like, retroactively, like, not canon or whatever. But like the moral of the story to me should be like, digging up the past isn't the way to go. It's like find a new way forward, start something new. Like you can learn lessons from the past and you can use some of the knowledge and wisdom, but it seems to me like Rey would be such a good starting point to something new, as opposed to, being like, well, now resurrecting, the Jedi.
Well, and so I'll say, this is a big part of when I realized how much you and I differed on Last Jedi, because that movie is much higher in my list. But the reasons why I was really excited to talk to you about it, because I think The Last Jedi is a fantastic movie, but a very controversial one. I think there's very legitimate reasons why people would not like it, and you've just spelled out some of them. The problem was the meta-narrative around that movie became, there's also a huge number of people who don't like it because they're sexist, racist garbage to some extent. Like, people who didn't want Rey because, they didn't want, the Asian character, the black character to be important. Like, and I'm obviously, the people who are that extreme are obviously a small minority. But certainly there's an awful lot of the attacks on Last Jedi that were coming from pretty bad places. Yeah. Which I think made those of us who love the movie kind of start dismissing any critique of the movie. Mm-hmm. And I think you're raising some really good ones. I think, first, just on this religion point, I'm very much with you. I think I didn't see the ending. The ending sort of made me worried, but I didn't see the ending quite as badly as you did. Although the new movie being called Rise of Skywalker makes me feel like the person who made this movie wanted to leave it open, and now unfortunately they're taking the wrong lesson.
Yeah.
But because to me, the central story of that movie is that the mistake Luke makes is in trying to rebuild the authority of the Jedi, and coming to realize, like, you can be a devotee of the Force, even the good side of the Force, or some medium version of the Force, without the Jedi at all.
Right.
And exactly what you're saying. And to me, I like the idea that at the end of it, Luke is really saying, I am the last of the Jedi, and both you and Kylo Ren are something, some kind, because Kylo Ren also is very distinctly, no, he's not a Sith. Yeah. And I think he's much more, he's not a good guy by any means, and I'm not one of those who's sympathetic to him, and I really don't want to see a Kylo Rey love story. But yeah, I guess to me, part of what I loved about The Last Jedi is that it raised those questions, is that it really dove into, just how broken were the Jedi. Especially because, and this is going back a bit to our discussion of the Clone Wars, but I think you make a good point. One of the things that I think I like so much about the Clone Wars, and I feel is paid off in Last Jedi, is kind of the story that Anakin is the micro version, and the Jedi themselves are the macro version of the same story.
Yeah.
Because in the same way that, like, it's nice to think that, like, Darth Vader just killed Anakin, it's actually that, like, Anakin fell and destroyed himself. Mm-hmm. Now, instead of the Jedi were destroyed by the Sith, it's that the Jedi fell and destroyed themselves, largely.
Yeah.
But I will agree with you that the Anakin story is set up in the original movies. That reading of the Jedi, I'm going to rewatch and look really closely, that reading of the Jedi isn't from the original movies. I think it's a really good take on it, and one I really appreciate. But I can also understand someone saying, like, but that's not how the Jedi are. That's not what the story of the fall of the Jedi is supposed to be.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. That's interesting. I haven't watched the original movies since I've seen The Last Jedi, or for that matter, I think since I've seen The Force Awakens. So, I can't really. I think that would be interesting to watch and sort of think about, for sure. One thing that, like, I didn't see The Last Jedi in the theater. I contemplated not seeing it at all. Partially because I just knew what was going to happen. Right? Like, I knew that The Last Jedi, before they even had a name for it, I just knew it's like, oh, episode 8's like when Luke's going to die, right? Like, because it's just like, that's the way the arc goes. And that's just not a story I'm interested in. And that aspect of it, like, they did it in a way that I didn't dislike with the intensity that I thought I would. But this, like, this goes to like things like Arrested Development season 4 when Netflix bought it, and I was like excited. Oh, they're making another season of Arrested Development. It wasn't like the first 3 seasons. Like when they made a Jason Bourne movie called Jason Bourne, like after years after the third movie. And I feel like whenever this happens, whenever a piece of fiction is kind of like on the shelf for a while, and then they come back years later and pick up and try to kind of like pick up where they would be years later, I can't remember seeing it done well or done in a way that like it was a story I wanted to see. Like if you're gonna show like what happens to Luke after Return of the Jedi, like I'm much more interested in like the actual training of all the different apprentices or whatever, or Padawans, and how that goes. How did Kylo end up where he ended up? Like them picking it up where they picked it up, to me, was just very unsatisfying, and like I just basically knew Luke was going to be Yoda from I guess it was Return of the Jedi where Yoda dies, but like whatever. Yeah. But I just felt like that was definitely what was going to happen. It wasn't really what I wanted to see. A lot of other parts of the movie I felt like didn't make that much sense, like kind of the other subplots. I like all the new characters taken individually. I think The Last Jedi brings up interesting points of like when you're having a rebellion, like the idea of chain of command is a little odd, It's like, well, if this is a rebellion, like, it's going to be harder to get people to take orders, Right. And that's one reason that a lot of rebellions probably fail. But like, and then like, what are they fighting for? I guess they're the Republic, but then the Republic fell, and then now they're the rebels again. I feel like there's a lot of interesting stuff in there, but that the actual story just wasn't. It wasn't like a story that I wanted to see, and it wasn't because the main star was a woman. Like I think that's great. I really like Rey's character. I just kind of wish that like they just started clean like 200 years later, because like then it would make sense that like all this stuff was forgotten, like the idea that that was all true. It's like, yeah, no shit, Han, it was like a few years ago. Like
I mean, and there it's the same in a lot of ways. What you're saying about Luke is like what I was saying about Han from Solo. And I think here it goes to that, if I remember correctly, Luke is much higher in your personal pantheon of the characters than he is in mine. And
higher than Han, and that's why, Han getting whacked in The Force Awakens, to me was kind of like, oh, well, that sucks, Like, I just didn't care as much, because he's not a character that I cared as much about, Right. I mean, I didn't love that, and The Force Awakens was a unique point in time. I'll say.
That's very true.
Yeah. But yeah, there's a lot in these movies that I like a lot, but there's also a fair amount that I dislike, and having seen them as an adult, they don't carry the same sort of like formative. They don't hold the same place in my mind or my heart or my memory, basically.
Yeah. No, I think that's really true, and I can understand that. I'll say, there was a lot that I was disappointed about in terms of the return to the world in general. That for me, I'm going to more talk about when we get to The Force Awakens. Okay. I think, and like I said, I think I appreciate the take you have on it. I liked the subplots of Last Jedi a lot more, but then I think, to me, this is by far the most grimdark of the Star Wars movies, and I love I think I like grimdark an awful lot more than you do. And I think it's fair to say that this movie represents a fairly distinct change in the tone of the Star Wars movies and of the story of Luke Skywalker. And I think that, for me, I think that it becomes kind of down to a question of taste, because I think those are very understandable, and like I think it's very believable that Luke would go on this particular journey. I think it's also believable that you could say he would go on a completely different journey, and whether you want one of those stories or another, I think that's to some extent, I don't think there's a right or wrong about it. It's just different perspectives. But to me, that's why this is interesting, is because this is one of the first times I've really heard someone articulate why they didn't like Last Jedi as much, Again, for reasons that weren't just the dumb dude bro things
Right.
that we think we often hear about.
Yeah.
And I'll admit, when you and I first did this, I was worried that it was going to be absolutely the last on your list. So I do appreciate knowing that it's still for you a lot better than the prequels.
I mean, it's just so much better as a movie. Like, it's not the movie I wanted to see, you know? All those terrible reasons that some people don't like it or didn't want to see it or boycott it or blah, 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 like, make me like it more, you know? Or make me want to like it more. I just don't like it that much because... You know, it just wasn't the movie I wanted to see at the point in time that I saw it. Like, I don't even know if I want to see more Star Wars movies, you know? But, you know, it's a well-made movie. I think it has some plot issues and stuff.
Right.
But it's just, you know, this is a list of preference. So, like, if I loved Attack of the Clones as, like, a cheesy, like, you know, The Quest or whatever kind of... you know, campy thing, like, I could have put it first and be like, yeah, this is a terrible movie, but, like, I just think it's hilarious. Like, I don't, so I put it last. But, like, you know, it's hard to put a movie that's just clearly better than a bunch of other movies, like, below them. I just, you know, when I was first thinking of doing the list, I was thinking that would be my last one. I'm like, it's just not. Like, I definitely liked parts of it. You know, the way things went didn't bother me in the way that I thought it would, because partially also because, like, watching all these different, like, superhero fiction things where there's, like, 100 different stories for each character, like, it's allowed me to kind of let go of the way a story goes, because it's like, well, you know, that doesn't, like, headcanon's a powerful thing, you know?
Yeah.
Like, for me, Dexter didn't end the way Dexter ended, you know?
And I'll admit, I am quite possibly very significantly headcanoning this movie. Because to me, like, the two moments of, you know, like, the book still being in the bag,
right?
That I hated that one moment, because I really do want to end it with, the Jedi are done.
Right, yeah.
And it's funny, because for the exact opposite reason, I'm also kind of trepidatious about the new movie. I want to see it. I have tickets for it on opening night. But I'm hoping that the Rise of Skywalker is, to some extent, the idea that, like, the Skywalkers as a new, like, idea on the Force is going to replace the Jedi.
Interesting.
And replacing a cult of authority with a cult of personality doesn't seem like a good step.
Right.
But at least if it's supposed to be about, you know, a new direction and getting away from it and honoring the idea that the Jedi are done, I'm all for it.
Right.
If it's, nope, we're still very hard into, you know, the Jedi, I'm concerned. If we learn that Rey is actually a Jedi, is a Skywalker herself,
right,
I might walk out of the movie. Like, one of the things I loved about The Last Jedi was the confirmation that Rey isn't anybody.
Well, the assertion made by Kylo Ren. I think, you know, we have to understand that a character's word is a character's word. I mean, you know, Obi-Wan said that Vader killed, you know, Anakin.
Right.
And, you know, so I'm not taking that as, like, that's definitely what happened. But
I guess my take on it was that also that sort of some of her personal explorations with the Force were kind of leading her to the same place.
Right.
And maybe you're right, that's not exactly the same, but yeah, that's certainly my hope. Okay, so that was your number 7. So what's your number 6?
My number 6 is 2 movies.
Okay.
A New Hope and The Force Awakens, because they're the same movie.
Interesting. Okay.
Where, you know, I think they're both kind of cheesy but well executed cheese. You know, I already mentioned about how, like, going back and kind of telling the story with some of the same characters didn't really work that well for me. But, you know, at the time it came out, it was like, oh wow, a Star Wars movie that isn't, you know, bad the way the prequel trilogy is bad. You know, there are some really big payoff moments in that movie. You know, like Rey getting the lightsaber to come to her, you know. And so there's parts about that movie that I loved. The original Star Wars, A New Hope, like, maybe I'd put The Force Awakens ahead of it. Like, it doesn't hold the significance to me that it does for a lot of other people.
Interesting.
It felt like just a much shallower movie than Empire or Jedi. It introduced all, things, and it got, things rolling. But to me, it was almost like a proof of concept of like space opera. And then Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi really did the narrative work. So like I guess I'd actually put The Force Awakens as like 6A and A New Hope as 6B.
That's interesting.
I like Luke in A New Hope is like kind of boring, Han.
No,
there's things about it that it's a movie that I loved as a kid, but like not at all on the same level as the other two movies in the trilogy. It was like a clear last place when there were only 3 movies.
Yeah. That's I'm going to say I have A New Hope higher, and I'm going to hold off my thoughts on it. But let me just talk about Force Awakens, because I agree with you. I think there's a lot of fantastic moments in Force Awakens. It introduces us to 3 really good new characters in Poe, Finn, and Rey, all of whom I really like. I like that it is a little bit more of a it's starting the grim dark take on things.
Right.
Yeah. The showing us the idea of like who are these stormtroopers and what does it mean to be a stormtrooper with an attack of conscience and stuff like that. Yeah. I really liked. I think you're right. In a lot of ways, they're the exact same movie, and for me, that makes Force Awakens a lot worse because it just feels like it's copying instead of doing anything original.
Yeah, for sure.
But the other thing, I think the biggest problem I have with Force Awakens is, and this is something that we kind of referenced in Last Jedi, but I put the blame on Force Awakens. To me, I am really interested in this like 3-part story of you have an authority that fails because it becomes corrupted. And then you have a story about the rebellion and an attempt to reassert a democratic authority.
Right.
And so what I really wanted out of these 3 movies was to see the Republic trying to be rebuilt and our heroes being part of the power structure in the authority as all that corruption is happening and as the First Order are the kind of, the rebels, but the rebels for something that is horrible. But like that power balance, and so we're getting to see a fundamentally different power balance.
That would be really interesting. I want to see that movie.
Yeah. And so I think for me, the reason The Force Awakens is where it is, and 6 is pretty high, but still is lower than the others. I think it's mostly because of that moment, because it made it. No, we're going to once again have our heroes be the plucky rebels struggling against everything, and that just felt so derivative when I wanted this to be a new kind of a story.
Yeah, it's this like meta reboot where it's just so weird to have the original trilogy have this arc that takes you somewhere so much different at the end of it than you're at the beginning of it.
Yeah.
And then to have the 7th movie, the one that comes right after Return of the Jedi, to be like, oh yeah, but, by the way, like we're just going to go back to the beginning. It's like, it makes it almost feel like that trilogy like didn't even happen or didn't need to happen. You know what I mean? And so it kind of cheapens it, and I really, really dislike that aspect of it. And that's part of sort of what I covered under when we were talking about The Last Jedi in terms of like, that's not this. No, this is a different thing. But it's not the story that I want to see in terms of what comes after Return of the Jedi. Like 35 years later, and like they tell us that the Republic's like being rebuilt, and then it just gets like boom, in a snap it's gone, and it's like, so they just didn't. It's almost like they got to save on production budget because they never had to show any of the Republic. Like they never had to show any of Alderaan in the original trilogy.
I will say. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, it's just I really don't like that aspect of it, and then by the end of Last Jedi, it makes the world feel small.
Yeah.
No,
I think that's very true in a way that, like we said, like Clone Wars and even to some extent Solo makes it feel much bigger. Which is part of also why I'm going to be so angry if Rey is a Skywalker.
Oh, right.
Because again, it's part of that much smaller.
It's like, aren't there other people in this world?
Or even if she's like a Kenobi, or she's a descendant of some of them. If I could make her a descendant of Yoda, I'd be curious. But other than that,
I think she's probably a Palpatine. But
yeah. Oh, that'd be interesting. But yeah, I think the other thing with Force Awakens that I will say is that I did And I continue to absolutely love the character of Kylo Ren. Because, you know, and there was a great analysis piece that was done about this, about how, like, Kylo Ren is actually the perfect villain for our times.
Right.
Because he's not the all-powerful guy.
Yeah.
He's kind of the dude bro in his mom's basement who wants to be the all-powerful guy.
That's exactly, yeah. He's not a Nazi, he's a neo-Nazi.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He's the kid who can, you know, trace his ancestry back to some Confederate general and thinks like, oh, those were the good old days, you know, and just the little bits of, like, the way he holds the, you know, the Vader mask and the way he's kind of wearing this ridiculous, like...
Yeah, the way he throws tantrums. Like, I mean, I guess Vader did that too, except he just seemed badass when he did it, because he had his own Star Destroyer.
And he throws tantrums, but even there, like... I mean, the crew are terrified of Vader's tantrums. Yeah. Kylo, it kind of, to me, it's kind of like what I've seen where, like, you know, how the company treats the boss's son.
Right. It's like,
it's like,
this guy.
We kind of have to respect his tantrums, because if he goes and tells Daddy, we could be in trouble.
Right.
But we don't respect him the way we respected Vader.
Yeah.
And also, I love that, like, you know, Vader had this incredibly imposing outfit. Mm-hmm. Because he was half machine, it kept him alive.
Right.
Kylo Ren has an outfit that is reminiscent of that because he wants to be intimidating.
Right. It's just like, fashion. It's like
there's no point to it. So I will say I thought that was one great part of that. To me, then I'll go to number 5. Number 5 for me is Return of the Jedi. And here I'm going to say my top 5. Mm-hmm. I think there's a break between. I think starting with number 6, there's a big gulf to me between number 5 and number 6.
Yeah.
The next 5 that I'm going to name, which I think I get the feeling that you and I still have. We have mostly the same top 5 for you, me, or maybe the same top 6 because New Hope is higher for me. But if I just wanted to say 1 through 5 are all a tie, I could almost say that.
Okay. For me, that's kind of like 1 through 4.
Yeah.
Because my number 5, I'll just say, is Solo.
Yeah, that's
which,
okay,
like, maybe I'm trolling a little bit.
That's legit.
But, you know.
I like Return of the Jedi quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of what I was thinking about for these rankings is how would they feel as standalone movies?
Right.
And I think Jedi is the one that the most feels like it is a payoff of some of the other movies.
Yeah.
And again, there I'm talking about ways to critique it. I will say a lot of reasons why some people don't like Jedi is the Ewoks. I love the Ewoks.
Yeah, me too.
I find them adorable. I'm still so angry that the remastered version took away Yub Nub.
Yeah.
Because outtake sometime you and I can sing that song because it's such a good song.
Yub Nub for life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you know, Yub Nubbed first. But that's a deep cut reference.
No, yeah.
You know what I meant,
I get
though.
you.
But yeah, but there's so much that's so good in Return of the Jedi. The much larger space battles, and in terms of what you're saying about it feeling smaller, Return of the Jedi makes the rebellion feel a lot bigger to me.
Yeah.
Because it's all these different spaceships, it's all these different races coming together. It's this huge armada instead of just 20 X-wings.
Yeah.
The lightsaber battle is fantastic. Mm-hmm. The turn of Anakin into, you know, Darth Vader back into Anakin, and the way that whole thing is played out with the Emperor is so good. It's I think, you know, maybe another reason why I don't love it as much as some of the others. The Jabba the Hutt scene. That's a quarter of the movie, and I was so eager to get back to the rest of the. It felt to me kind of like we didn't even mention this, but one of the other things I hate about Attack of the Clones is that whole ridiculous fight scene at the end where they just have them fight new monsters. It kind of felt like just to show off what the monster studio could do.
Totally.
And that's kind of how I felt in the whole Jabba the Hutt sequence.
Yeah.
You know, like, you know, the Rancor thing is kind of cool, but and the moment of the Rancor keeper crying over the Rancor, which I missed the first couple times I saw it, it's such a fun moment.
It is.
And it is really nice to see.
What did the Rancor ever do? It's just being itself, you know?
It is really nice to see Leia get to be the hero and rescue Han.
Yeah.
But I just felt like that whole sequence of the movie when I was so jazzed up to get back to the fight against the Empire, it was just not what I wanted to see. And so I think that's why, even though it's still very high and a movie I've watched literally dozens of times and will continue to see dozens more times, it's a little lower than the others to me.
Should I talk about that one now, or come
yeah,
back to
if
it?
you want to, if you want to go into Jedi, because I think we've talked about Solo. You've said a lot about your feelings on Solo already.
Yeah. Well, it's further up.
Okay.
maybe we'll circle back to it.
Okay, cool. Okay. So your number 5 is Solo.
Yeah.
What's your number 4?
Rogue One, which I would say could be number 1. I think it's probably the actual best Star Wars movie.
Yeah.
In terms of just as a movie. I don't really even remember there being things about it that really bothered me. I felt like I knew what the ending was going to be before I saw it, and that didn't bother me. I just felt like it was... I just think it was really well done. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot more than The Force Awakens, because it felt like, telling a really good story in the Star Wars universe that's not about Jedi, but it's got, the Force is still this idea, and you get a guy towards the end, like maybe using the Force or maybe not, like we don't know, when he goes to do whatever he does. I don't know, it's like pushing a button or something. I don't remember. But like there's like, it's got to go from point A to point B and do a thing, and like maybe the Force helps him, maybe it doesn't, but like, I love that ambiguity,
Yeah.
It feels like very real to me. And I just think it's a really good story, and it fixes A New Hope,
Yeah.
Like, it fixes this huge plot hole. It's like, oh, that's not just this ridiculous oversight. It's like it was actually built in on purpose by a subversive, empire engineer, I guess. And the idea that within these evil organizations, there's people who are, like sometimes you need someone on the inside doing some bad things in order to try to overcome them. And it felt very human to me, or very, I don't like the word human in that context, but I don't have a better one.
Relatable? Yeah,
very relatable, very, very, the people felt like people, including, the droid, and it just, I think it's a great movie, and, I saw it at a time when I wasn't like super psyched to see Star Wars movies, and I loved it anyway,
Yeah. Well, and I think this is the it's interesting that you and I, like, our 1 through 6 are pretty similar. 1 or 2 changes are like, bottom is pretty darn similar with 1 or 2 changes. I think this is the only one where you have the exact same, because Rogue One is my number 4.
Yeah.
And I think you're right about that. It might just be the actual best movie.
Yeah.
Like, I think if I had absolutely no sentimental attachment to any of these movies,
Yeah.
Rogue One would probably be my favorite.
I think so as well. I mean, for me.
Yeah, all the things you just listed I think are so true. The characters are so well developed, and it's kind of the way all the complaints we had about the prequels, and that I had about Solo, and that you had about The Last Jedi, it's that I want to see more stories told in the universe that are about new people, and that this is, to me it's a great thing, because it's again, it's the in the trenches things, because I am fairly certain that, Leia, acknowledges that great heroic sacrifices were made to get us these plans. Like, she says something about that in New Hope. I don't think she knows the names of any of these characters.
Right. Yeah.
And I love that. I love that story of, like, these little, and that
they don't get to be legends.
Yeah.
But they do something that changed the entire outcome of, the rebellion of the galaxy.
And tell me if you feel the same way. To me, that really reminds me of the Clone Wars TV show. Because so much of that is, again, also about, like, the people in the trenches.
For sure. Absolutely.
I will say there is one moment that I had that I, that was a little bit off to me, which is, in New Hope, part of what we're establishing is that Vader has this suspicion that the plans are on Leia's ship.
Right.
But that Leia has at least a believable story that she's just on a diplomatic mission.
Right.
And that part of the tension in New Hope is, who do we believe? Who does the Empire believe?
Right.
Vader watched her take the plans.
Yeah.
It's again one of those moments where I think one of the things that I don't like when a movie is trying to fill in the gaps of something is they don't leave room for subtlety.
Right. Yeah.
Like, to me, the much better thing would be if, like, those plans got beamed to a different ship and Vader has no idea what ship it is.
Yeah.
But it, and because again, I will say, like, the Tarkin, back from the dead moments, they didn't bother me.
Right.
They weren't 100% believable, but they didn't bother me.
Yeah.
When Princess Leia turns around and says, what's in these transmissions? Hope.
Oh,
I cried big time. I mean, I thought that was such a perfect moment. Mm-hmm. Especially given all that Carrie Fisher has come to mean.
Yeah.
But yeah, other than that, it was fascinating to see, like, what do the ordinary people think about the Force,
Right, yeah.
I do think we get one person who's kind of a Force user, and it's not the button person, it's the blind guy who basically still fights incredibly.
Oh, that's what I was talking about.
Oh, does he also do the thing with the button? I just don't remember that.
I feel like he's involved. I don't know.
Yeah.
I saw the movie one time.
Okay.
I haven't rewatched really anything in a long time.
Yeah.
Except the Clone Wars series. I watched it several times, I think.
Even the battle scenes I thought were really well done.
Yeah.
Especially because it felt to me a lot like Vietnam. All these kind of like fighting through the rice paddies and like the kind of helicopter type things dropping people off, and it was just and I think the other thing is that I don't like stories about perfectly good guys and terribly bad guys.
Right.
And at the same way that this was, like you said, showing that even within the Empire, even with the people building the Death Star, there were some people who were having attacks of conscience. I love the flip side, that even in a rebellion, you've got some people who are pure and good and upright and of heart, and you got people like Cassian who are saying, like, look, sometimes this guy is a hero and he's my friend, but he's going to get me caught, and if I'm caught, the rebellion suffers, so I got to kill him.
Yeah.
And that's pretty dark side.
Yeah.
But also I think he's right,
Right. Yeah, it's like, well, if you were willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, like, it might not be the other side who shoots you.
Yeah.
There's a scene like that in one of my favorite TV shows that I think I won't mention because it's a spoiler. But it's a point where somebody basically they kill one of their allies because it's what they think is the best thing for their cause. And they've basically just consigned themselves. They're like, look, I'm going to do whatever it takes, even if it's horrible in a vacuum,
Right.
Because, for them, the end justifies the means, basically.
Yeah. So that's, we both have the same number 4. What's your number 3?
My number 3 is the Clone Wars animated series. It delivers the story that I wanted from the prequels.
Yeah.
And it builds out the world to an extent that no single movie could do, no trilogy could do. I mean, I think if you look at how many hours of content, it's like 40 hours of content, and there's 10 movies? That's like 20 hours of content.
Yeah.
So it's like the Clone Wars series is like twice as big as all the feature films combined. And so they really have more opportunity to do stuff. And some of it's packaged in a little bit of a sort of kid-friendly whatever. I will say I watched the entire series in Spanish, so it's like possible that... I mean, I clearly had a very different experience than I would have if I'd watched it all in English. But I watched it multiple times because first I watched it with Spanish subtitles and then just audio, and then I'd just put it on sometimes later.
Right.
And there's moments in that series that to me if they were in the other movies, those other movies, the prequel movies, they would have been just so much better.
Yeah, I think that is very true, and I'm very much in agreement with you there. I think part of why I have it a little bit lower is because you're right. There are a lot of moments that are more for kids, and there are some sections that are kind of eye-rolly, and some episodes or plot lines that are just kind of eye-rolly. Mm-hmm. But overall, the things that I feel like my understanding of the Star Wars universe was fundamentally changed by that TV show. Mm-hmm. On this podcast, as I said, this is the first episode of what I hope is going to be a whole Star Wars universe podcast. I'm going to try not to spoil it too much, though I spoiled it a little bit here, because probably one of the things we're going to do is, now that Clone Wars is becoming available on Disney Plus, that I'll probably be working with someone with whom we're going to have just kind of a regular episode of every couple of weeks, maybe every other week, we'll watch, 4 to 6 episodes of Clone Wars and record an episode about them to kind of just do a full rewatch of the show, because I think it's worth it. And there's so many interesting plot lines to explore, about new sides of characters we already know, about, fascinating new positions on the world, about people just trying to stay out of it.
Right.
So yeah, I think, the kids thing is the only reason why I have it a little bit lower, as well as the fact that a TV show that I'm watching over a series of weeks is never going to grab me in quite the same way an individual movie does. So it's kind of an apples and orange thing to compare it.
For sure.
But you're right. I think also it is still very, very good for me.
It's amazing to me that the series is so much better than the movie.
Yeah.
Like, because it feels like, shouldn't they be kind of similar? Like, shouldn't the movie have just been like, kind of the best of what you could have done out of the series, like, earlier? But, like, no, but if you watch, like, the first few episodes of the series, it doesn't necessarily get off to a great start. I mean, there's parts of the beginning that I think are really cool.
No, I when I was doing that rewatch, when I was doing that watch for the first time, I got about halfway through season 1, and I remember, messaging you and being like, really?
I was like, wait for it.
And a lot of the best shows have, my friend Matt Carroll, who does the Orville podcast with me, and he also does the Marvel podcast and now a Star Trek podcast, he's doing a rewatch of a lot of TNG episodes, and is agreeing that, like, Star Trek The Next Generation is a great show with a really rough first season.
Right. That's common. It's like especially usually the first half of the first season, like, there's just this, like, well, what does this character do? Who is this person? Who's, it takes a while to really have a show come together. And, the way in a movie, it's like, you've got to figure that shit out before you film it, right? Like...
Well, and I do think that, to some extent, also the worst of that also happens in... Because I think especially when you make a spin-off, one of the worst things that happens is you have to start by giving the people who loved the original thing enough meat that they're willing to go with you as you go further and further away from it.
Right.
And I think one of the biggest problems with the Clone Wars is the movie introduces a couple of new characters, but really tries to be pretty close. It doesn't try to introduce entire new worlds or entire new concepts the way the TV show can.
Yeah.
And also, I think, to me, of all the different sort of parts of the world that it further fleshes out, I think the one that's done the weakest in the Clone Wars TV show is the Hutts. I just never really liked what they build of the sort of the larger Hutt criminal empire, and that's a major part of this movie. And so that's I think another thing to take away. But you're right. I in some ways, I said there's a drop off between 5 and 6, but also the biggest drop off for me is probably much more between 7 and 8, because 7 was my Clone Wars TV show.
Right.
I could easily see it going at 3 too. So yeah, that makes total sense to me. My number 3 is The Last Jedi, which, and I think I talked pretty much at length about why I love it so much.
Yeah.
But just to kind of say again that it to me gives more of that wider universe feel. I also think that Last Jedi came in a moment when it was incredibly needed. If I remember, it came out very soon after Trump was elected, and when, like, it felt very easy to feel incredibly beaten down.
Yeah.
And there's always been a justice element to all of these movies, and certainly Revenge of the Sith tried to be kind of have some commentary on on the Bush administration.
Right.
With lines like "Only a Sith speaks in absolutes," which is the problem because that's an absolute. Bad dial. But yeah, I think part of also why I'd say Last Jedi is so important to me is it was so exactly the movie I needed given what was happening in the world.
Right.
But yeah, so what's your number 2?
My number 2 is Empire Strikes Back.
Okay.
It's a story about a dude who's fed up with his boss and just wants to spend some quality time with his kid whose childhood he missed. So, he gets him to drop out of school, cuts off his hand, but, because he loves him. And, yeah, I mean, Empire Strikes Back, I almost put this number 1.
Yeah. I'm a little surprised you didn't, but I now know what your number 1 is.
I'll explain that in a minute. I mean, it could be number 1, whatever.
Yeah.
It's, I think it's probably the best movie of the original trilogy. And probably not even like pretty clearly. It cuts back and forth between couple different things going on. The Luke training with Yoda thing really, I think, is the most you get to see about the Force.
Yeah.
And I think that part's, I think, really fun and interesting. And then the showdown between Vader and Luke and just the whole dynamic of that and the uncertainty, like where he tells him he's his father, but then he's like, no, that can't be it. And then that's the first time that you realize that Leia is Force sensitive at the least, and it's just, it also had a really significant sort of role for me in high school. I watched it a ton. I watched that more than any of the other movies. And at some point I was really relating to Darth Vader, which I can't say I do quite as much anymore. Mm-hmm. I guess fortunately, but it's where you can come to understand Vader as someone besides just the bad guy, in a scary suit. Where you see that, he actually wants something, and he wants something very personal, and he doesn't really want to keep doing what he's doing, He wants to quit his job, he wants to rule the galaxy, but he's not really devoted to the Emperor. He is because he made a decision, back in Revenge of the Sith, I guess, which, we don't know exactly what that decision was, but where he turns and he's got, a master who's the Emperor, and we don't really know too much about the Emperor, but we know that that's there's something going on there, but it's that's not really what Vader wants. What he wants is to join forces with Luke, and it makes him a character in a way that I feel he's not up until that point.
And this was I mentioned at the very beginning that you and I had a lot of discussions, excuse me, about these movies, and then in some ways you really turned me around on some stuff. And this is, I don't even know if you remember these conversations, but this is the one that I most remember. Yeah, I think it was during breaks in poker, when you were explaining to me your theory that Darth Vader is really the protagonist of the 3 movies. Yeah. And at first I thought you were nuts.
Right.
But then when you pointed out, I went back and rewatched Empire and saw just how much you're seeing this kind of gradual evolution. And, you're right, it's that, it's not that he's a hero, but it's that story that I think actually a lot of Marvel and other hero movies are starting to tell pretty well, of the henchman who starts to have real doubts.
Right.
And it's not that I think he has, I think that there's a moral point that he gets to that I think is still very far away from where Luke takes him in Return of the Jedi, because I think he's still in a you and me controlling the universe, power and control, and let's force choke anybody who disagrees with us. He's still pretty down with that.
Yeah.
But I do think I don't think he has some altruistic, let's save the universe, but he definitely has a respect and a love for his son, and an admiration of him, and a desire to sort of bring him back into the fold. And you're right, I think he really does have that push back against the Emperor. I think this is a canon that sprung from that reading of the movie. One thing I think is really interesting is in later books that my friend Jonah Kellman actually helped introduce me to, that really go into the history and the ideals of the Sith.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things those books, and I know those aren't officially canon, but they're still, I think, an interesting take on it.
Yeah.
They really spell out this idea that that's the whole nature of the Sith is, yes, there's always two, a master and apprentice, but it's not that the apprentice just waits for the master to die.
No.
It's that the apprentice should always be looking for their own apprentice, and the moment when they can kill the master and have the apprentice ready to become the master.
Right.
And that's exactly the pattern that Vader is following.
Yeah.
And to some extent, you're kind of like, why is the Emperor so stupid to set that up perfectly?
Right.
But I think that's part of it, is it showing like the Emperor having risen so high and become so powerful that he's beginning to believe in his own, invulnerability,
Yeah.
and just the idea that Vader would turn on him. Because I think actually actually the more I think of it, what the Emperor's doing is also very much within the Sith mindset, because he probably is recognizing that Vader is falling a little bit, or Vader's just getting old, and it's not that he wants both Vader and Luke, it's that he wants Vader and Luke to fight, and whichever one of them wins will come out stronger, and that'll be his new apprentice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he's basically like, that you want that guy to be your apprentice, and then you're going to replace me. No, I'm going to take that guy, and he's going to replace you.
Yeah.
And let's not forget that overconfidence is the Emperor's weakness.
Yeah, and it is just in the same way that I said I think Rogue One is just, fundamentally the best made of these movies.
Yeah.
I think there's very little argument that Empire is number 2, and that many people would say Empire is number 1. It is just the humor in it, the romance, which, my God, the romance in this is so much better.
What, in Empire Strikes Back?
Yeah. Then Attack of the Clones.
Then that, yeah. I mean, there's some problematic elements that maybe we won't get into, but But as far as like actually being a convincing love story compared to Attack of the Clones, it's the dialogue.
I definitely agreed about that, and certainly the I mean, I mentioned before really liking how Leia comes off in movies like Last Jedi. The gender dynamics that are happening in these original movies are not the best by any means.
Yeah.
Fully agree with you there.
Yeah. At the same time, given the time period, they're not the worst either. I mean,
agreed.
Like, she is a strong character,
Yeah. But, and also just, I mean, I think, as you said it before, this movie contains the best line in the entire, universe of, I love you, I know.
Yeah.
And so I just think I agree. I think we're both agreed that it's number 2.
Yes. Yeah. It's my number 2, and your.
And then it sounds like we each have as number 1 the other one in the original trilogy that we just happen to love the best.
Yeah. Exactly.
And for you, it's Return of the
Jedi.
For you, it's Return of the Jedi, and for me, it's New Hope. So, do you want to start with? So, what is it for you about Return of the Jedi that makes it so good for you?
It's my first movie memory. The first time I remember ever going to see a movie was at the Ziegfeld in New York on 54th Street. This like giant one-screen theater. I remember going with. I think I went with both my parents, but I remember like being on the escalator with my dad, and I remember being in the theater and seeing Luke's lightsaber pop up out of R2, and like that whole beginning scene. I understand what you mean about that whole thing, but it has such a memory to me. It has a place in my life, and then also the. I feel like it has a very satisfying conclusion of, Luke believing in his father, who's basically given no one any reason to believe in him, that he would, turn back, but it's a story about a kid who believes in his no good delinquent father and, gets him to finally stand up to his boss, and he cuts his dad hands off because, like father, like son or something. But, it's just, I've always, since high school, that's kind of around then when I was a teenager, I realized, Empire was the best movie out of the 3, but Jedi it's just my favorite, because I do love the original story, and that's the end of the story, and it actually delivers what to me was a satisfying conclusion, which I think is really hard to do in a trilogy. You know, it's really hard to do, and it completes Anakin's story. And I just, you know, the ending with like where he's burning the, you know, the uniform and the mask and I guess his body, but not his body, right? Because it like disappears like Yoda and Kenobi. It's just, you know, and the music, and that whole duel at the end, you know.
Oh, it's so good.
Yeah, it's just the whole thing where, you know, there's Vader and there's Luke and there's the Emperor there, and he's like, basically, he wants them to fight, so, like you say, like, he'll get whoever's the strongest, you know. And I think he thinks it's going to be Luke, you know, and I think he thinks Luke will probably be easier to control after that, especially after, like, he's killed his own dad, you know. And then, you know, Vader, like, baiting him, you know, about his sister, and then Luke giving in to the rage, but then, like, being at that turning point and being just like, no, you know. And that, you know, that people can make, like, he makes that decision, and then Vader or Anakin makes that decision to be like, you know, no, I'm not just going to let this guy kill my kid, like, he's going down that hole there, like, you know, which I don't know. I feel like the Emperor should probably be able to survive that, but whatever. But,
yeah, that's, you know, and here again, we don't.
Maybe he did. We'll see.
The construction of the new Death Star with once again having a, you know, press here to blow up switch is again not the best.
Right, exactly.
But no, I think I mean everything you just said is true, and I think I'll explain my own reasons why it's not my number one. Yeah. But in so many ways, you know. New Hope, Empire, Return of the Jedi are one solid trilogy, and in some ways one solid story with 3 parts in a way that the prequels are not, and just with a wild divergence in tone between Force Awakens and Last Jedi, those 3 movies are not going to be. And so it's very hard to separate them. And yeah, everything you just said is so true. I also just love the whole... for a movie that has been so based in technology and so based in space and man, or, you know, people, you know, sentient being built worlds, going back to a primitive society and having it be kind of a nature-based society. Like, it's kind of silly in some ways, but just to me, I mean, like, those scenes of the logs destroying the, you know, AT-ST walkers and stuff like that, like, they're just so powerful.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can't argue with any of that. For me though, as you've probably figured out by now, my number one is A New Hope.
Yeah.
And I think it's for a couple of reasons. Part of it is, Return of the Jedi is the first movie I remember seeing in the theaters, but New Hope is the first movie I remember seeing.
Yeah.
So I think that sentimental power. I think though also it's because New Hope is, understandably, I think the most self-contained story of every movie they've ever made, because it's the only one where they didn't know if they would ever get to do it again.
Right.
And I really like that. And I kept going back and forth on what's the rubric I'm going to use, because is it the one that is, and in some ways I thought about 3 different rubrics, and a different movie would have won for each one. Mm-hmm. Because if the rubric is just for the original trilogy, but also for all these, if the rubric is which do I think is the best movie flat out of the original trilogy? I agree with you, it's Empire. If it's the one that gave me the most to think about, because, and I'm going to talk a lot more about this as the podcast goes on, Star Wars has become a fundamental part of my philosophy, and as people learn, I am a Christian, a very, very liberal one, but it's a part of my background, and I used to be a minister. And my final paper in seminary was about, you know, comparing the theologies of Jesus and Yoda. And in many ways, I think Return of the Jedi is the one that raises the most questions about the nature of the Force and the nature of good and evil, and what does it mean to... And I remember, especially because it does the thing that I love a good movie to do, it doesn't give clear answers. No. You know, you and I have had long debates about how much does Luke fall or not fall towards the dark side in that final lightsaber battle. Like... And so if my rubric is what's the movie that makes me think the most and gives me the most to chew on, it's Jedi, Return of the Jedi. But if it's just the, like, you know, it's my last night on Earth and I get to watch one movie, it's going to be New Hope. Because I think it's just and here's a weird thing. the space battle to destroy the Death Star is probably my favorite space battle of all time. And it's cheesy, and it's clearly models, and you see that, but I find that endearing.
It's really good. Like,
it's, for the time, and
it's really
even
good.
Today, it's really good. And I just, the extent to which once things become so CGI'd, it's harder for me to believe them in the same way.
It's weird because it's like, yeah, it's clearly models, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I haven't watched it recently, but I watched it recently enough, I think, to be like, well, that doesn't look as good as I remember it looking. But, like, you can tell what's going on.
Yeah.
That's my biggest pet peeve about modern, like, just battles or fight scenes or whatever, is there's this deliberate obfuscation of the action. Where it's like, we want you to have that, like, disoriented feeling, because, like, if you're really there, like, you wouldn't see everything that was going on, and, like, honestly, that's one of my favorite things about Avengers. Like, the original first Avengers movie is it's, like, it's bright, and you can see everything that's going on. The climactic fight is in daylight, you know? And it feels like in A New Hope, like, at the end, you could just, you know what's going on, you know, and there's maybe some moments like, oh, where are they coming from? You know, but it's like, it's there. It's there for you. You can understand the action, and I feel like that matters, you know?
Yeah, I'm 100% with you there. I really like the way you put that, because you're right. There is something to be said for, like, giving you the experience of what the character is going through, of the chaos of war. But I also just like the big set battles, you know? Yeah. I recently started playing this miniatures game called X-Wing, and it is literally just moving models of X-Wings and TIE Fighters and A-Wings and B-Wings around a big map and rolling dice to see if you hit or miss.
Yeah.
And it's the greatest thing in the world to me, because it's exactly what my inner 10-year-old has always wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I like that in, you know, even like in Return of the Jedi, that great final space battle against the Death Star, it's fun and it's crazy, but I don't have a clear sense in my head of, like, where are the Death Stars and where's the Rebel fleet and where's the fighters, and, like, I don't have that clear picture.
Yeah.
I absolutely do for New Hope.
Yeah.
You know, it is so clear to me what's happening, where it all is. And yeah, it's just, you know, and Joseph Campbell does this great thing about the hero's journey and how much Star Wars plays into that, and now there's a lot of critique of the hero's journey model, and I agree with that, and I think it's not the only way to tell the story, but it is still a damn good story, a way to tell a story, and so that, yeah, for all those are reasons that A New Hope is number one for me.
Yeah, I thought it would either be that or The Last Jedi. And,
yeah.
For you.
In some ways, I've really thought about putting Last Jedi even further ahead, but I think even I can recognize that there are some plot holes in Last Jedi, that there are some weak moments, and maybe this is pure nostalgia. You know, I think Last Jedi was the movie that I, as a adult, really wanted at that part in time.
Yeah. And
it spoke to me and is something that I want to think, like, I think if you told me, I am planning to do a rewatch we're going to, me and someone else will watch each of these individual movies and then have a podcast entirely on them. And I hope you'll get to do some of those. The rewatch that I do of Last Jedi is the one I'm most excited about, and I think that will make the best episode, so I think we're going to have the best conversations about that.
Right.
But it just does, and I'm excited to rewatch it for that reason. Mm-hmm. But, like, when it first came out on Netflix, I was super excited. I watched it once. I was happy.
Yeah.
When Star Wars first came out on Netflix, or there was some time it became available in one of those, I must have watched it 8 times in a weekend. You know, I just... Yeah. And that's why I think, I'm not saying it's the best, but it's far and away my favorite. I'm guessing for you, Jedi is the same. Is Jedi the one that you would just happily watch over and over again?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if there's anything that I would watch a ton of times, like right now, but it and Empire were the two that I watched over and over the most, and I would probably watch Jedi the most times, like now. If it was like, you have to pick a movie to watch 5 times, like, I'd probably pick Jedi. Like, partially because it's like, there's a payoff. You know, at the end of it, it feels like you're at the end of something. You know, in Empire, it's like, watching it too many times in a row, it's like, well, I feel like I have to watch Jedi now. You know? Whereas A New Hope is like, at the end of it, it also feels like you've reached a conclusion, right?
I think that's a good point. And maybe that's why it's interesting that for the two of us, we switched whether it's New Hope or Jedi, but we both has Empire's number 2. Because you're right, it is the best setup for a conclusion that I think I've ever seen on film. But it's not, there's no catharsis.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So, cool. Well, I think this was a good thing. I'm really glad we got to do this.
Me too. What was that, like
Paul,
20 minutes? 30 minutes?
Yeah. We said it would be 20 minutes, half an hour. That's about what we kept to.
Perfect.
Oh, dear God. What a way to start this new podcast. But Paul, for people who are like, wow, this Paul Hoppe guy is really cool. I want to learn more about him and follow more of his writings or creations. Where can people find stuff you're doing?
Depends how soon this comes out. Go to zenmadman.com and I'll try and have something there.
Sounds good. Well, Paul, thanks again for being part of this great conversation. And to all of our listeners, thank you. I started this podcast as well, like I've started my other podcasts because I love these conversations. And I love getting to talk about it with someone like Paul or like Jacob, my co-host now on Superhero Ethics, or Matt Carroll on Orville Universe podcast. But really also, I love hearing from you all. So please let us know what you think. You can tweet at us or find us on Facebook. Both of those are Star Wars Universe Podcast. You can also find us at email, starwarsuniversepodcast@gmail.com. Write into any of those places or tweet at us or whatever you want to do. Let us know what you think. Let us know if your list is pretty similar to ours, if you have total discrepancies, if you think we are completely wrong about something, or you really want to agree, or just we made a point that you want to agree with or disagree with. Let us know. We'd love to hear it. And if you're okay with it, we'd love to talk about it on one of our next episodes. So thank you guys again. I also just want to give a quick plug again for the other two podcasts I do, the Superhero Ethics and the Orville Universe podcast, as well as some other great podcasts that the people who I am connected with do. The Marvel Cinematic Universe and the DC Universe podcasts are two great podcasts for people who really love the kind of thing we're doing on this podcast in terms of like looking at a whole range of media and diving into it and looking at it from all sorts of angles. Also great for that kind of thing is the Orville Universe podcast that I'm on, as well as if you're a fan of the new TV show The Watchmen, Who Watched the Watchmen? Who Watched, with a D, The Watchmen, is a great podcast that's just been coming out about that show as well. So check any of those out. Please subscribe to this one. We're just getting this off the ground, so we'd love to get some reviews. If you can give us a 5-star review on iTunes, I know it's always kind of weird to just kind of ask for that straight up, but frankly, the way that the little gremlins inside the iTunes mechanics works, the more 5-star reviews we get, especially in this first couple weeks of launching, the more it is that other people are going to get to hear this, and we're going to get to build a real great community and keep on recording these. So please do that. Please share this with your friends. Let us know what you think, and keep on listening. Have a great day.